And so typically I keep that just in junior high, but I wanted to show you an example this week that just really blew me away. Junior high wrestling was a worship experience. And so here's what I mean. So our junior high wrestlers do a lot of wrestling at Kirkland Junior High. And so they're having a match, and Kirkland Junior High, I think, has a student with Down syndrome. I think his name is Max. And so I think it was Coach Pete. Somehow somebody got the idea of let's have Max wrestle, and let's have him win. That would be a big deal for Max. And so Christopher Murray, Devin's younger brother, said, "Yeah, I'll do it." And so they got out there and they wrestled, and this was the match. And I want you to watch Max. Don't worry about Christopher. Watch Max. So, one of the reasons why we do things like athletics, and why we do music, and why we do art, why we do service projects, why we do anything outside of these walls, because we take what's done here outside to a world that's going to go, are you different? What would make a kid do that? Because Max got the same question that you and I get when we come home. How's your day? Well, how's Max's day? That's a pretty good day. And that's going to mean a lot to him. So that's what we talk about, giving up yourself for the greater good. I mean, that's living out your faith. That's taking your faith outside of the walls to a world that's real hungry for it. So I offer that to you as an encouragement and as a challenge to say, okay, you live a life outside of these walls. What can you do to do something like that? Because you never know who's paying attention. You never know who's going to need it. We make a lot of assumptions. You live out your faith in a very real way. When you give up yourself for the greater good, good things happen. All right? So let's pray. Lord, thank you for that example, and I pray that all of us would take that to heart and just have our eyes open and would be led by the Holy Spirit, and to say the word that somebody needs to hear, to do the gesture that somebody needs, just that we would represent you, Lord. We would be your ambassadors in this world, and that we would take our faith beyond these walls for your glory and the good of others. We thank you for what we're going to hear today. I pray you'd open our hearts and open our minds for what it is that you have in store. In your name, amen. So our guest today is a guy who's taught me a lot, and so I'm excited to give him the mic, and so he'll set up a little introduction here, and then we'll go from there. Please welcome Mr. Ulstein.
Hi, I just want to show you something that happened to me a couple of times. is the main armpit.
This is called a grand mal seizure. And what's happening is her brain is firing off all kinds of signals all at once, and every part of her body is going into convulsions. When it happened to me, I chewed my tongue up. I couldn't talk for a while. I chewed up my cheek. I remember my eyelids were sore from the convulsions.
So I'm documenting it for the doctors.
Okay, well, back in the day, they would have said I was demon-possessed, and if they weren't able to cast the demons out of me, they would have killed me, and everybody would have cheered. God is great. Well, we know that that's not demon possession now, and actually, I'll show you the cure for demon possession right there. It's $1,000 a month, but this month probably won't happen to me. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the way we judge people based on things that yeah, okay, here we go. Based on things that are really about neurology and mental illness. And when we talk about sin, sometimes we talk about acts of volition, things that we do. And so there are certain things that if I do them, choosing to do them, that's one thing. But we don't always have complete control over what we do. What's going on, Mike? I'm pushing this. Maybe I can just push that button. So anyway, I'll move ahead a little bit. We're told not to judge, and yet we have people called judges. And we have to judge sometimes things that happen. You know, if somebody robs a bank, if somebody hurts somebody, we have to judge the thing, but we have to be careful that we don't judge the motives of a person's heart. You would never do this. You would never make fun of somebody who had cancer because it's a disease, and it's a terrible disease. But sometimes we'll take somebody and say, this is funny, when in fact this guy probably has a mental illness that's about as funny as a heart attack. And yet we see him, you know, living on the street, pushing a buggy around, and people will yell out things from cars and make fun of this guy. Well, if you look at this, this is from the Centers of Disease Control. At any room like this, about 13% of us are probably having some kind of mental or neurological challenge. It's, you know, just like some of us have a cold, or some of us have the flu. It's just a disease. Or sometimes it's just the brain not working at optimum power. But all of these things people make fun of. You know, I remember having what sure looked like ADHD in retrospect. And you know, people, why did you do that? I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? You ever had this? And the answer is actually, I don't know. Am I the only one? You know, sometimes we just don't know why we do things. But panic disorders, eating disorders, depression, often people just think this is funny, or they judge people. Well, I want to talk about a range of things, from the very, very serious kinds of mental and neurological problems to things that are, you know, we hardly notice them. But when we talk about psychosis, sometimes we use the word psycho as sort of a slang term. But medically what it means is all of a sudden there's a big change in the person, and they can't function well. And sometimes they don't see things realistically. And one of the most common of the major illnesses is what's called bipolar or manic depressive illness. And sometimes this can be mood shifts that last over periods of months. Sometimes it can be several a day. And quite often people are judged and they're told, you're acting crazy, you must be on drugs or something. But quite often people with bipolar disorder are extremely creative. A lot of musicians and artists have bipolar disorder. And when they're in this high state of ecstasy, they actually create wonderful things. Vincent van Gogh painted this painting probably in a time of real ecstasy, but he also killed himself later when he was depressed. All of these people have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Kurt Cobain was Nirvana, Amy Winehouse. And Amy Winehouse was an abuser of drugs and alcohol and bipolar. But probably it would be better to say she had bipolar disorder and she abused alcohol and drugs. I remember when Britney Spears started acting, you know, in a bizarre way. And medically, bizarre doesn't mean you're crazy or stupid. It means there's behavior that we can't really understand in the normal ways. And I remember thinking, boy, she's at about the age, young adulthood, where people start to experience bipolar breaks. And Mel Gibson, I had a friend who interviewed him once, and he said he was afraid Gibson was going to fall out of the window of the hotel. He was so manic. He couldn't interview him. He just watched him running around. Tremendously powerful actor, but he's recently, done a lot of things that have gotten him in trouble, ranting about Jews and things. You can judge all these people and make fun of them, or you can say, maybe I should just think a little bit first. So what happened to her? And when she started acting up, I remember my Facebook just lit up with people saying, what a slut, what a moron, what a. But I thought, I've seen this before, where people have this huge change all of a sudden. And it tends to happen, around 19, 20 years old, where people start acting in really strange ways. They don't seem like the old person they used to be. And one thing we can do is judge her and say how terrible she is, or we could just hold back a little bit and say, maybe there's a reason for this that I don't understand, and maybe I should think a little bit. Here are some examples just from being a teacher here. I had a student when he was about 19 or 20, he bought a house, and then he bought a car, and then he bought a truck, and then he filled the truck up with dirt so he could have more traction. And I saw him, he was having a party on the roof of his house once. And everybody's saying, oh, he's really backsliding, he's falling away with the Lord, and all this stuff. And this was one of the first times I really noticed this. It was quite a few years ago. And one day he brought me up a note, and it was just filthy writing. And I was in the Navy, so it's pretty hard to shock me with language. But he had a picture of himself with a little halo. Then he had a picture of a lady we both knew with devil horns. And he said, I want you to look at this. And I said, well, okay. He said, she was a real bitch to me, and so I wrote this and I'm going to give it to her. And I said, and are you thinking then that she'll read this and think, I've been a bad person and I should change you? So well, yeah. Well, it's called hypergraphia, actually, when you just start writing. And I thought, uh-oh. Well, he ended up in the hospital for a couple of weeks, actually. This one girl was just the nicest girl you'd ever know. Always led the hunger drives and everything. After she'd been in college for about, a year, I met some of her friends and they said, yeah, she's really acting slutty. And I thought, slutty's not something I would ever connect with her. She said, yeah, she's in a beauty pageant. And, she was a lovely girl, but how some people would not be in a beauty pageant if you dragged them there with a horse. And I just thought, that doesn't sound like her at all. And they're saying, yeah, she's just turned into a slut. Well, again, she had experienced this big bipolar break. Had nothing to do with choosing to be a slut. This guy, I actually just talked to him this week. But a few years ago, I was in the hallway, and he said, can I talk to you? And I said, well, I have to go to class in a couple of minutes. And he said, well, it's Jesus and stars and light and the music. And he wasn't making any sense. And the more he talked, the more I realized he was really having trouble. So I stayed with him and had somebody cover my classes, and I stayed with him for 3 hours while we tried to get a hold of his mom. And his mom said, well, yeah, he's been smoking pot, and we're seeing a counselor. And I said, well, a lot of people smoke pot and they fly airplanes. I mean, this is not smoking pot. You need to talk to the doctor. And so she did take him down, and he was in the hospital for a couple of weeks. He did well, and then he got off the medication, because sometimes when you're mentally ill, you think you don't need the medicine anymore. And he was walking around over at the Arboretum naked, and he'd painted his body, and he was singing. And I'm sure a lot of people might have gone by and said, what a nut, haha, But he was sick. It was about as funny as if he had a heart attack. There was nothing funny at all. But he has people who love him, and he's been seeing doctors, and now he's in graduate school. He's doing really, really well, because it's an illness. It's not something bad he chose to do. Another boy, he and his dad and I were talking a lot because he was having trouble doing his schoolwork. And he called me and he said, I'm on a plane to Florida. And I said, oh, okay, what are you going to do there? I don't know. I said, well, where are you staying? I have no money, I don't know. And so you're flying to Florida with no money. And, I visited him in the hospital. He was actually strapped to the bed. He was so psychotic. But, he's doing well now. Another girl had terrific head injuries, and she's bipolar, and she's homeless from time to time. And she meets these guys, and she posts them on Facebook, this is the love of my life, and then she posts, he beat me up and tried to pimp me on the street. And, right now she's doing pretty well, but she doesn't always take her medicine, and she's kind of out there with not the kind of support system you really need to get well. I talked to another guy just 2 weeks ago. I had dinner with him, and he ended up in prison. And I would see things he posted on Facebook, and I knew what was going on, and so did his friends. But it took him a long time. He ruined his marriage. There's a restraining order from his wife. He's thousands of dollars in debt. But he's not a jerk. He was sick. There's a big difference. So what I'm trying to learn in my life is that things aren't as easy to describe as you think. A really cruel illness, and I have friends who have had this, schizophrenia, and it presents in a lot of different ways. But one of the things that often happens is you hear voices. You're hearing my voice because the air I'm speaking vibrates this thing. And an electrical signal goes into the speaker, and the air vibrates, and it goes into a little drum in your ear. And that transmits it to an electrical system, a signal that goes into your head, and your head says, that's Ulstein talking. Now, if I say demons are chasing you, you look up at me and go, Ulstein's standing up there with a mic saying something sort of strange. But what if you hear that same voice and there's nobody around? You know, it's really terrifying because you think, I don't get this. This is really frightening. And sometimes people think, well, maybe somebody's reading my mind. And it can make you really, really frightened. A lot of people laugh at this, but this guy's wearing a tinfoil hat because a lot of times people are saying, I don't know how to stop these voices. Maybe it's radio waves or something. But this is not funny. It's not the least bit funny. A lot of people experience hallucinations, visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory. I have olfactory hallucinations. It's probably because of the medicine. The medicine I take is the same medicine you take for schizophrenia. And sometimes I smell cigars, and it's just like somebody who's over there smoking a cigar. And at first I thought, who's smoking cigars? And now I realize my brain is telling me cigar smoke. When I was trying out all kinds of different medications, I would have visual hallucinations. I would feel really tall, and I realize I am really tall. But it was almost like I was above everyone in a sort of a strange way. And I thought, boy, this doesn't feel right. But I have a wife who really loves me. I have a home. People take care of me. But you know, if I hadn't been properly treated, I don't know where I would be. Sometimes people think that bugs are crawling on their skin, and it feels just like that's really happening. Well, here's something interesting. And sometimes we see behaviors that just seem inexcusable to us. Sometimes they just seem strange. But a good friend of mine, a professor of mine, thought that demons were tormenting him with numbers. And I had lunch with him one time, and he was showing me how the demons were using my phone number to torment him. And I didn't tell him, well, you're crazy or anything. He knew he was having trouble. He'd been in the hospital. And he's fine now. He called me one day, and he sounded just fine. And he said, I realize I just have to take my medicine every day. And he's been fine for a long time now. He's married to a woman who really watches him. And if he starts to feel that things aren't going well, his wife says, okay, now what are you feeling? Okay, well, have you taken your medicine today? Because it's an illness, just like cancer, just like anything else, it can be put into remission. Look at these guys, though. This is kind of interesting. When I see these guys, I get really mad. Except, think about this. They think that God is dooming us because of homosexuality. He hates your feelings. He hates Obama. He hates Israel. And God is happy when soldiers die because in their minds, God is punishing America for homosexuality by killing soldiers in Afghanistan. Well, really, if you stand back and think, can I sit down and reason with these people? Probably not. Is it because they're terrible people? Maybe. But I wonder, and so I pray for these guys because I really don't know why they do this. I don't think they just chose to be terrible people, even though what they do seems really terrible. Well, it turns out that schizophrenia sometimes appears in children very gradually. Most people have a break at some point. But, but it's abnormal brain activity. Sometimes people are just kind of paranoid. They think people are talking about them, but not to the point where you would think, oh, you need to go to the hospital. Sometimes they just say things that are kind of bizarre. And again, bizarre as a medical term. It doesn't mean you're stupid or something. It just means There's something that doesn't seem within the realm of what we would call normal or good behavior. When it's misdiagnosed as ADHD, it can be deadly, because with ADHD, you've got two parts of your brain that aren't talking to each other. And if you take a stimulant like Adderall, it just allows the brain to function normally. But if you take somebody who has something like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia and you give them a strong drug like that, it can actually push them into a real serious illness. And so, I'm not a doctor. I don't know. I don't know if somebody's got autism. I don't know if they've got bipolar disorder. Sometimes I know enough, though, to say, I think I'm going to call your dad and just ask him how things are going. I can't diagnose anything. But sometimes I can sort of see things that make me ask a question. This is kind of interesting because, we execute a lot of people in this country. And a study of 15 people on death row found that every one of them had strong traumatic brain injuries when they were children. Every one of them. There was nobody on death row who hadn't had severe brain injuries. And some by assault, some of them were molested, but they were psychotic people. And there was one case where a man was really wildly schizophrenic, and when he got to the hospital, the doctor essentially cured him. He became lucid and rational. He didn't remember killing people. And so the state said, oh good, he's sane, we can execute him now. And the doctor said, no, I didn't make him well so you could kill him. And so the doctor had to say, do I keep him well so they can kill him, or do I let him go back into psychosis where he's just living a hell on earth? I think we hadn't thought through that idea. In some states, people your age are sentenced to death, as young as 15. But again, when they study these guys, every one of these teenagers had severe head injuries. 12 of them had suffered, brutal abuse. Some were sexually abused. And when you mix those things together, it's really horrific. And so the question I have as a Christian is, do we give the death penalty to people who are sick? Or do we give the death penalty to people who have been injured? It's worth thinking about. On a much closer to home thing, we know that when you get concussions, it lowers your ability to function. And it comes back over time in many cases. What they're finding out now is that if you play a sport, for instance, or you get in an accident and you have a lot of hits, but you don't have a concussion, your ability to reason goes down. So what if somebody takes the SAT test and does really poorly and doesn't get into the college they wanted to get in, simply because they took a bunch of hits to their head? And if they'd taken it a week later, they'd probably be okay. So is that guy a slacker, or does he just have some head injuries? And there's a lot of really interesting research on head injuries now. It's a much more complicated thing than we used to think. This was an interesting guy. He told me, I'm such a slacker, I'm such a loser. I start off well every year and then I just fall apart. And I knew a little bit about this. So I took some big pieces of paper and taped them up on the wall. And I said, how did you feel this year in September? And he went, oh great, I was going to get a 4-point. And then it went down to kind of a baseline, and then down, down, down. And so I said, let's do this for last year when you were a sophomore, and it looked exactly the same. I said, well, let's look at ninth grade, and it was exactly the same. So I said, I rolled it up and I just said, I'm no doctor, but take this to your doctor. And a couple of weeks later, he said he talked to his doctor, and the doctor said, thanks. He had given him some tests, and the guy had what's called seasonal affective disorder. A lot of us have that, but it can become really debilitating in some people. And he wasn't a slacker at all. He had a mild mental illness that got treated, and he started to do pretty well. But it was easy for everybody to say, well, maybe you're smoking pot, or something. Well, that doesn't explain it. A lot of people would like smoking pot and everything, but that's not the case. Well, there are some behaviors that just make us mad. Explosive or intermittent rage disorder. Somebody's driving down the road and they want to kill somebody because they cut them off. Well, you can say, what a jerk, but sometimes that's a mental illness. Oppositional defiance disorder. If I say, excuse me, when you leave, I want you to pick up some trash back there, you might go, what are you talking about? I didn't do that. But some people, especially young people, you can't ask them anything. I had one guy once and he wouldn't tell me his name. I said, what's your name? I'm not telling you. I said, what do you mean you're not telling me? I mean, somebody will walk along and tell me. I don't have to tell you. And it just, everything was awful. And one day, I came around the corner, and one of the teachers had him by the throat and was getting ready to punch him. And I looked at me, and he said, I can't do this. I don't know what it is about this guy, but I just want to kill him. And we all kind of felt that way. Well, I didn't realize it at the time, but that was, probably a disorder that needed to be treated. You ever know somebody who lies about everything? They just lie about everything, or they steal. Some people steal things they don't need. All of those things can be treated. Encopresis is probably the one that makes me the maddest. And what that is the phantom pooper. And when I was in the Navy, we'd have this. You'd come back, and in the bathroom, somebody had pooped on the floor or something. And boy, I just wanted to take that guy and throw him overboard. But it turns out that there's a mental disorder that is caused by a lot of stress and some other things. It's very treatable. But sometimes we just say, you did this terrible thing, you are a terrible person. As opposed to, well, maybe there's a reason you did this. So diagnoses are refined all the time. In any science, you have what you know, and then you move on. In the early days of psychiatry, they had things like the Oedipus complex, where they thought that everybody had a sexual attraction to his mother, and we don't really use that anymore. It was helpful to a certain point. But then we went through behavioralism. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association said, homosexuality is not a disease. It just isn't. It doesn't fit the criteria for a disease. So they stopped trying to treat it as such. So the thing I would encourage you to do, which is what I'm trying to do myself, is just to become educated. And it's okay not to know what you're talking about. I mean, most of the things I do, I don't know what I'm talking about. But there are people who do know. And you can always ask somebody, I don't understand what my friend's behavior means. Ask somebody and see if they know. You can read, ask questions. The DSM-IV, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, is online. There's a Series 5, but it's not online yet because it's copyrighted. But it's interesting reading because it shows how different things present. And it gives you a sense of, oh, there's some behaviors I see. We're not doctors. We really don't know. But sometimes we can say, I love this guy. This is not the guy I used to know. Maybe I should ask some questions before I jump to saying he's smoking pot or he's fallen away from the Lord or whatever thing we've decided to say. So I guess in closing, I would say just try to be wise and compassionate and educated. Mental illnesses and neurological issues can be wildly dysfunctional. I mean, you can be so sick that you can't function in society. Most of the time, it's not quite that clear. Most of the time, it's kind of a shadow syndrome. And that's where we really get off. We judge people and we say, oh, well, you're doing this and you're doing that. So don't laugh at people. Don't marginalize them. And this is just one way to think about not judging people. It's not the only way. And I'm not an expert at all. I've done a lot of reading because of close friends I've got, because of my own brain seizures and things. But I know enough to know what I don't know. And I know enough to know when to ask a question. And I'm starting to know enough to just pull back on the judgment and not to laugh at Britney Spears and not to laugh at Miley Cyrus and not to laugh at Kurt Cobain and say, what an idiot, he shot himself. He must be a drunk. Just look at people and see what's going on in their lives. If somebody's really depressed, you can't tell them to cheer up. You have to ask questions. You can't tell somebody with an eating disorder, oh, just eat something. It's not that simple. And they're not being bad. They're not being stupid. So anyway, I hope this is a little bit helpful. And thank you very much, and have a great day.
All right, I don't think we have any metal chairs up, so I think we can go back to team time, and be some questions there for you, and enjoy the rest of your day. Tell Mr. Ulstein thank you if you see him around